just opened Blender. I'm in the default 3D viewport layout. I'm going to click and drag to select everything and press X to delete it. Then right away I'm going to hop over to my geometry nodes workspace, and I'm not going to exit out of this left window yet. I'm going to change it over to my video sequencer. We're going to be creating an audio visual, so I want to add sound to this. I'll make sure I'm at the first keyframe, add sound, and the default settings are just fine. Add sound strip. Now if we zoom out on our timeline, we can see how long our song is. So when I zoom in, I can see 3,168. So I'm going to right click on this panel right here and create a horizontal split, put my timeline in, and then I can change the length of my animation to exactly 3,168. There we go. It's as long as the song. Now I can close this window. I'll right click, join areas, and X this one out. So I've got the 3 panels we'll be using for our 3D model now. And just to double check, when you press play, you should be able to hear the song. There we go. So to start off in our geometry node editor, we need some geometry. Up in our 3D viewport, I'm just going to add a plane. Now we can click New in our Geometry Nodes editor to start modifying the plane. And we actually don't want a plane. We're going to want a cube and a curve. So I'm going to delete that group input. So that deleted our plane. In our Geometry Nodes editor now, we're going to be adding a mesh primitive cube and place that. The size, I'm going to click and drag across all 3 and press 2 to scale it up to 2 meters. And we can plug that into our geometry. And now we've got our cube, 2 meters squared. And then we're also going to be adding a circle. So Shift A to search, and you can tap S to search and type in circle. We'll want curve circle. And what we want to do in this animation is instance the cube on the curve and animate the transformation as the cube moves around the curve. So we're going to get an instance on points. I'll Shift A to search for instance. And we don't want to instance our cube. We're going to be using the curve as the points, and then our cube will be our instance. So now it's placed a cube along this curve that we've created, and we can change the number of cubes by the resolution of points on the curve, down to only 3 cubes and upwards of 100. And then the size of this entire circle with the radius. So now you can see that circle. Next, we want to give our cube more geometry and more vertices so that it can deform to the music. So we're going to add a subdivision surface and increase the levels to 4 for now. Now what we want to do is orient the mesh so that they all would be scaling radially. If I looked down at this, we want it to be like rays of a sun, not like parallel lines. So we can do that by aligning the Euler to vector. Shift A to search for align, and I'm going to place it down to the side here and use it as the rotation for my instance. And I'll align it to the Y, and then as the vector, we want to use our curve and search for a curved tangent. Apply the tangent to our vector. So now based on our factor, we can control the orientation of these pieces. And if we change the axis, obviously the axis of rotation. So this is exactly what we want. It's radial like the sun when I increase the factor to 1. So now we want to animate the rotation of these objects about the curve over time. So we'll use a scene time node to animate our curve with a few math nodes. So scene time, and this will give us the seconds and animate our geometry node modifier over time. And what we're going to be animating with this is the rotation of our instance. So I search, rotation, rotate instances, and I'll be placing that after our instance on points. And then our scene time will be plugged into our rotation. So if I press play, you'll see it rotate over time. So obviously that's not the music, that's just a constant modification of the geometry rotation over time. What's really cool is using math, you can really modify how this rotation appears. So if we add a few math nodes, change this to multiply, and maybe even Shift D to duplicate it, add this to divide, and press play. You can see that slows it down. If we multiply add, would speed it up. So you can do some really crazy stuff just with switching back and forth the speed of your rotation, and then changing the value of what it's multiplying or dividing by. So I'll just keep those at 0 for now while we're working. And what can make this really cool is also using an index to input your value. So we can search for an index, plug this into our value. So then it changes the rate and the rotation of different objects throughout the entire animation. Makes it much more visually interesting. And if you want, go in and even add another math node in between here. Get really creative. And before we get any farther, remember to save. We should have saved a lot sooner. The last thing I want to do to modify the rotation is add a combine X, Y, Z to be able to change the axis yet again that this is rotating around. So this is now what we want. We've isolated it on this X axis here. We can always change it to Y. It's indexing, it's staying radial, and it's rotating exactly like we want. And you can change the appearance of that by changing X or Y or even both, X and Y. But one more step is to subdivide our cube. We want to add a subdivision surface to our cube so it deforms, and maybe take the levels up to 4. And then we're going to be animating the size of our cube and the rotation to the music. So I'm going to use another combine X, Y, Z, and then off my X, Y, and Z, I'll just plug in a few values that I'll keyframe in. So value, and this will now be keyframed to the song. I'll Shift D to duplicate, as this will. And you can even plug this value into maybe X and then Y and Z. So you can see it's 0 right now. So the transformation of these little objects will now happen to the music. Down here, let's use a mix RGB to combine our music with the math as well. Mix RGB and drop it into our scene time to combine it with the scene time that's already being applied. And then we can plug in a value, data search value, into the second color. So this mix will be combining, depending on the factor, the transformation of our rotation of our objects. We'll see once it's moving. So I'm going to press play and you'll see the movement of the objects, and then as I change this factor and mix it with this other value, the rotation will change. So when I increase and decrease this value, it's being mixed with my scene time node, depending on this factor. I can reduce how much they're mixed, and it only takes in color 1, or I can increase and it'll only take in color 2. And then one more item I'm going to add is actually off of my combine XYZ node. I'm going to duplicate this value over here, and then I'll plug it into my X. And I'm going to use this value of my math, plug it into my Y. That's the rotation effect that I'll be looking for. And so far these are rotating exactly about our curve that we've created, but to change your pivot point will really alter how this animation appears. So if I click and drag on my X just slightly, click and drag on my Y, my Z, now when you watch the objects rotate, it's a lot more wild. And remember, we can always go back to our curve and increase the vertice count on our curve with the resolution, so way more objects appear. So with my resolution at something like 100, you can see how cool that looks now. And you can always change your radius of your overall sphere if you like. Now when we press play, maybe it's going too slow, so you increase your multiply or your add or your divide. We're starting with the divide. Let's start with the multiply so it's a lot faster. Just for a different effect, change around your math nodes, and then let's see. And we get that dynamic spiraling effect, how that spiral changes throughout the animation because it's building off of the index. That's why we inserted this index down here into the math. And if you don't like that spiral, you can change your offset point, the X and Y, and then maybe change your subdivision or your resolution of your curve. Increase it a bunch. I'm at 500 now. Alright, there's our geometry node tree. Now let's get it animated to the music. So let's start from left to right. I'm just going to go to this value, select my geometry node object, the value, hit I. Then I need to go to vertical split and go to my graph editor. So with all of those objects selected, I'm at frame 0, bake sound to F curve. Key, bake sound to F curve. Let's start with 0 to 500 and reduce our takt time as far as we can. bake sound F curves. So there's our first step. We've got that first value baked into our F curve, and you can expand your geometry node object and click on that value. Then within our graph editor, you see this tiny window over here, modifiers. So we can modify the F curve with an envelope modifier. If we add a control point, you can click and drag to change the amount of noise in the curve, more or less. So reduce it or make it much more chaotic. So now this is finally movement that's being mapped to our song throughout the entire song, and you can see it's loud and then the song ends. So that's the first movement that we've animated to our music. If we give it a little test, we can see. So our object is flat right now because we're using the value of our x-axis basically at 0. If we zoom in our graph editor, we're way down at the minimal level, 0.2 for scale, and then it'll be up to almost 0.5. So this value will constantly change throughout the song. There we go. So the first transformation of our little cube is happening. So let's repeat that now for everywhere we placed a value. So let's go back to keyframe 0, select this other value, hover over it, press I, go up to our graph editor, key, bake sound to F curves. And this time I'm going to go from a minimum of 500 to maximum of 1500, bake sound to F curves. So we can see it's a different frequency now that's affecting our object. And it's actually at 0. Both of these values are at 0 at the beginning of the song, so our object disappeared. As soon as I scrub forward in our timeline, those little objects begin to pulse with the music. So now we can transform it with the X or the Y and Z axis independently. Let's add a modifier into this sound curve, envelope modifier, add a control point. So now we can change how it responds on each of these axes. So you can make it a flat disk by maxing it out in one direction or keep them pretty round. All right, we're getting there. Let's work our way down to our other value. This one will be mixing with that overall rotation animation. We're at keyframe 0, value selected, hover over it, press I, then graph editor, key, bake sound to F curves. And again, let's make this respond to a different frequency from 1500 to 8000. So this will actually be manipulating how the rotation happens, that overall transformation of the cube. And we can reduce that if it looks too crazy with our factor. So this mix will give us control of that. So right now, we're mostly just using our scene time to animate it. It'll be a steady second by second count. But if we increase our factor, it'll only be relying on the music for that value then. So it'll go just back and forth if we have a factor of 1. And that isn't very cool, so that's why we use this mix to reduce it slightly so it moves steadily throughout the entire video, but you still see it react to the music and jiggle back and forth when the bass hits, for example. So that's looking pretty sweet. And you can see when we start at 0, we kept all those transformations at the start of the song at 0. So it's kind of cool that our curve starts at the single circle and then building off of the index of the rotation and the scene time, it actually changes throughout the entire animation. It'll never be quite the same. Before we go, let's add an envelope modifier to this F curve as well. And you can see even by manipulating the envelope of going past 0 or not, this can create a really cool effect. I'll just keep it right there. We're almost there. One more value to keyframe. Let's go back to 0, object, value selected, press I, and in our graph editor, the same thing, bake sound to F curve. One more, let's go from 8000 to 15,000. And this won't have a big effect, but if we use that envelope modifier and add our control point, we can raise and lower this min and max value so that F curve is more noisy. So you can kind of see that the rotation and the speed that it's traveling around overall is reacting to the music. Just one more little detail that catches your eye. All right, now we're ready to render this. So all we need is a single material. I'm going to get one more node, search for a set material node, and It's going to be super simple. If we go over into our material properties and add a new material, the only thing I'm going to do is increase my metallic all the way up. And if we go over to our rendered view, I'm going to be using Eevee for this rendering. We're going to need to change the background of our scene in our world properties, color, take my background to black. Then I'm going to add a single light, Shift A to search for an area light, G to grab, scale it up, and then increase the power of our light in our light properties to 10,000. So you can see it highlighting that little ring of objects now. Now we can grab our light and Shift D to duplicate, R to rotate, and I'll change the color of this light, make it something eye-catching, like pink. And I'm going to change the shape of both of these lights to a disc because you're going to be seeing these lights in the reflection. I want them to be a disc shape. If you're totally not done yet, you need to apply your material first. There we go. So now we've got our reflective material applied. And don't forget, go back and tweak that speed of your rotation by tweaking the divide. So now it'll happen a lot slower. So this is kind of a cool effect that I like. It starts as a circle and then over time it forms that spiral tortoise. So that's why we used all this math and mixing with our scene time, so we can create that cool effect of transformation, starting as a single ring and turning into this 3D tortoise, and throughout the entire animation reacting to the music. Keep tweaking with this math and you'll create a cooler effect than I've been able to reach here. Now to render out our scene, I'm going to use two 3D viewports. I'm going to change this to viewport, pivot around, and then I'll use this one for looking through my camera. So I'm going to press 1 on the number pad to look orthogonally straight, and Shift A to add a camera. I added that camera looking perfectly along the y-axis. That was why I was looking straight with number 1. Now in this view, I'm going to press 0 to look in my camera, and in my view panel, I'm going to click camera to view. So now we're controlling the location of our camera, pivoting around. And before you place it, maybe scrub through your animation and see if you like that composition. There we go. And I'll press N in this view, uncheck camera to view, and leave my camera in that spot. So this will be my final rendered view. And I think I actually want another light. I'm going to Shift D, duplicate, place it on the other side, and rotate, and make it a color that's a little bit opposite on the spectrum. So there's some green on one side and some pink on the other. Now for our output properties, I'm going to be using Eevee, but I might turn up my rendering sample to something like 100. Then we'll go to our little printer icon and change the output location. And we want to change our file format to FFmpeg video. And you have a choice here. If you expand your encoding, you could stay with Matroska, and that's safest, to export a MKV. Afterwards, you need to remux your file to change the file format. But MKVs can stop halfway through and the file is less prone to corrupting. Or you can export straight to MP4 using this MPEG-4 encoding, and then change your output quality to perceptually lossless. And then you want to keep your audio in the video. Right now you have no audio, so you need to select AAC, and those settings are okay for audio channels. I keep them as stereo. So now you're set to export. You have your output location. You could change your resolution to 4K, for example, 3840 by 2160, and this will output a 4K animation now, but that'll just take more time for your computer. So then I'll save one more time before I click render always, and then render animation.